Okay, hello everybody. Um, Welcome to a virtual workshop that's even more virtual than the last one because this time no one is actually here. I'm going to be doing this by myself because I need to do a catch-up session for the people who weren't there last week, and also just in case anyone is wanting to come back to this workshop and just kind of like see what we went through one more time. It might also help them as well. So, today we're going to be working on compression, and I'm actually going to do two workshops on this. I'm going to do compression part one, which is what we actually went through last time with the rest of the group, and I'm going to do another one tomorrow called compression part two. And um, yeah, I'm in a new space, as you can probably tell. Um, the sound here is much, much worse. So um, you might be able to hear my echo a little bit differently. I'm still working on it. Okay, so today we're going to be going through compression. Um, and uh, First, we need to start by defining what compression is. And before we can do that, we need to talk about dynamics. So um, we talked about dynamics actually in the first session. We were talking about like the foundations of sound. And so compression works on dynamics. So the definition of dynamics that we're using is that it's the variation in amplitude, the quietest and the loudest sound. So it's the difference between the quietest parts of a sound and the loudest parts of a sound of any instrument that's in the session that we're mixing. So, for example, a drum kit has a very large dynamic range because you can hit a snare drum very quietly, or you can hit the snare drum very, very hard. And the difference between those two volumes is going to be very large. Something like an electric guitar is going to have a smaller dynamic range, especially if it's using distortion on the electric guitar. If you have a distorted guitar amp, for example, it's going to have very, very little dynamic range because it's pretty much always going to be on. The same with a bass guitar. If you have like a bass guitar like the bass we have in this song, there's very small dynamic range. And then you have instruments like voice, which is probably the most dynamic in when we're mixing something, because often drums are pretty much playing at the same volume all the time, even though they're capable of playing different volumes. The voice is often actually singing at different volumes at different times because some notes they need to be able to hit it, with more oomph, with a little bit more volume, and other notes they're probably going to be wanting to sing it a little bit quieter just to get a different tone. Um, so we're going to be going through and listening to the dynamics of all these different instruments and processing the dynamics with a compressor. So now I will define a compressor. A compressor is a dynamic processing unit. We're working with digital plugins, but you can also use hardware compressors if you have the luxury of having hardware equipment. Um, so that means that we're going to be diminishing the dynamic range of the instruments that we're applying compression to. So one way you can think about it is that a compressor takes the loudest parts of the sound and it turns it down, and it makes it closer to the quieter parts of the sound. And overall, you can then, once you've compressed it, so all the louder dynamics are brought down to a quieter volume, you can then turn up the overall volume of the track, and it means that you have more headroom to work with. So let me give you an example. If we have this vocal, I'm going to just press play and we can listen to it. So let's listen to this. Okay, this line when she sings Hold You, we can hear two very starkly different volumes. Hold is very loud. You is very, very quiet. So you probably couldn't even hear it that time. Just then when I pressed play, there was you. She was singing you. And so together we hear the hold very loud and the you very quiet. So we can't actually hear the you at all. Okay, Now if I turn it up, now we can hear the U, except the hold is way too loud. So we don't really have much headroom to work with, because eventually we're starting to get this feeling of like we're, kind of like repelled by the music. We're feeling kind of like, it's a little bit too much at that point. So what we need to do is we need to compress it. And so we're gonna learn how to do that, and we're gonna do this one at the end, because this is the one that requires the most amount of knowledge to be able to compress it. Vocals are notoriously one of the harder instruments to compress, because they're so dynamic, and when you apply compression to them, to a voice, because we are so familiar with how a voice works, you can really hear the compression. And sometimes that's a good thing. Other times, you might not want that. You might want it to be very transparent sounding. So if we want it to sound transparent, we need to really know how to work it so that we can make it transparent. So first, we're going to learn what compression is by applying it to a few different instruments. So I'm going to solo the drum kit, and I'm going to have a listen to it without any compression applied to it. The drummer is very consistent. A very good drummer can play really consistently. It doesn't sound like it's poking out too much. But I'm going to just put a compressor on it anyway, just to demonstrate what a compressor does. I'm going to use the FabFilter Pro C2, just for the sake of the size of it. So I've just put this on the drum bus, on the parent channel for the drums. And I'm just going to put everything on neutral so we can slowly introduce different things. So right now the compressor is on, but I've set it so that it's passing the drums through without affecting it at all. So it sounds like this. So this is a clean drum sound. And now I'm going to compress it really, really heavily. I'm going to compress it in a way that we often wouldn't do in music, just to give you an idea of what compression does, okay? So we're going to hear that the attack of the drum, every time the stick hits the snare drum, every time the beater hits the kick drum, is turned down, and the sustain of these instruments is going to be turned up. So first, we hear that the attack is gone completely. Now I'm going to turn it up. Okay, so now we're hearing very extreme compression. We're also hearing that all the background instruments are starting to come up in volume, because the compressor is turning up, because we've turned down it's turning down the loudest parts of the sound. I'm actually then turning up the quieter parts by turning up this parameter here, which is the wet gain. So I'm turning up the output of the compressor. And by doing so, I'm turning up the overall volume of the compressed signal. So now you're hearing what's called makeup gain or wet gain. So I'm bringing it back up to what the volume that it was at before, more or less. And we're hearing that the quieter sounds are now turned up to about the same volume as the loudest parts of the sound. So the snare drum and now the horns are basically playing at the same volume. There's no horns yet. There you go. The horns are very loud. If we turn this off completely, now we're hearing the attacks, but the horns and the guitars and all these other instruments are not so loud. So that's the effect of a compressor. And it's good to show it on the drums just to give the example of what it does. Even though this is a very, very extreme example that I've shown you. This is a very colored demonstration. It's good to do it on the drums because we can hear it. And if we're just giving the demonstration of what a compressor does, it's good to be able to hear it as obviously as possible. So yeah, so that's a compressor. So let's go through and using the same example of the drum kit, I'm gonna define and demonstrate all of the different components that make up a compressor. So the first thing we need to talk about is the ratio. Pardon me. The ratio determines when we are compressing, how much does it turn it down by. So basically a compressor. Oh, actually, first I'll give you an analogy. So a way you can think about a compressor is that it's like if you are listening to music in your room and your neighbor is telling you to turn it down, right? You have your hand on the volume of your stereo, and at a certain point, your neighbor comes in and says, "Hey, that music is too loud. I need you to turn it down, please." And you turn it down. And then when they leave, you turn it back up again because you really want to hear the music as loudly as you were before. So then you turn it back up to that volume that it was at before. The neighbor comes back in again and says, "Hey, that's too loud again. Can you please turn it down?" And you do it again. So the point at which the neighbor comes in is the first parameter. So we're going to talk about this one first, the threshold. So the threshold is the sensitivity. How sensitive is your neighbor when they're coming in to say, turn it down? So let's say you're going to turn it down to, basically like all the sounds are like completely flattened out. And let's say that your neighbor has, let's say that they're not very sensitive at all. That means we'll have a threshold that's quite high. So close to 0 decibels. So threshold is measured in decibels. It also goes from 0 to negative infinity. So at 0 decibels threshold, that means that your neighbor doesn't care at all. So there's no compression being applied at all. So you can see, as the drums are playing, this green line is shooting up. And you can see that it's not hitting the point at which it would start to compress. And actually in this part over here, you're going to see a red line that once we start bringing this threshold down, it's going to start showing you how much you're compressing. So these little dips, it's showing you exactly how much it's turning it down by. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I've got the threshold all the way up so your neighbor doesn't care. Now I'm bringing it down so your neighbor is starting to get a little bit irritated and starting to tell you to turn it down. So every time the drum hits, the neighbor comes in and says, "Turn it down, please," right? And so now your neighbor is very sensitive. So virtually every drum hit is now being turned down by a lot because they're telling you to turn it down by a lot. Okay, so the threshold in this analogy is how sensitive the person that's telling you to turn it down is. The ratio is how much you're going to turn it down by. And a ratio goes from 1 to 1, which a 1-to-1 ratio is no change at all. So you can turn the threshold down. So the neighbor is telling you to turn it down, but you're not turning it down at all. You're just ignoring them completely because you have a 1-to-1 ratio. A 2-to-1 ratio means that you're turning it down by half. So you can see here that the graph isn't going directly up like a diagonal like this. It's now halving the volume. So every time sound is, let's say, 10 decibels, you're turning it down to 5 decibels, just to give a arbitrary numerical, just a number to give you an idea of it, whatever. So this is halving the volume. So you can hear it's actually quite transparent. It's turning it down, but it doesn't sound too intense. I'm turning up the wet gain to compensate for how much it's turning it down every time the drums hit. So to me, like, I can hear that that's compressing. However, the average listener isn't going to really hear that as compression. To me, I can hear that the attack, like the snap of a snare drum, the punch of a kick drum, these are the things that are now disappearing. If we turn it up to a higher ratio, it means that, for example, a 4-to-1 ratio, the result is going to be that after the threshold, the signal is going to be 1/4 of the volume it once was. So it's going to be turning it down by 3/4. Okay, and once you get to infinity to 1, it means that once it hits the threshold, it doesn't pass it at all. It completely flatlines it. So that's what we call brick wall limiting. So limiting is a form of compression where you don't allow anything to pass that threshold point. Now I can really hear it's distorting the drums. The snare drum basically doesn't sound like a snare drum anymore. The kick drum still kind of sounds like a kick, but it's like lost a lot of its power. And the snare drum basically just sounds like a period of noise, a very short period of noise that's playing every time that the snare drum is hitting. So I'm going to put this, I'm going to keep this to at the highest level of ratio. I'm going to keep this threshold low because I'm now going to demonstrate the time constants, which are the attack time and the release time. So these are parameters that work with the timing of the compressor. So, if we go back to the analogy, when the neighbor comes in and tells you to turn it down, how quickly do you turn it down to the point of the ratio? The speed that you turn it down is determined by the attack time. So we can have an attack time of 0. So as soon as the neighbor opens the door, it's already down. It's already down to, completely flatlining the sound like we have at the moment. So let's start with the attack. If we slow the attack down, that means that when the neighbor comes in, when the threshold is crossed, and tells you to turn it down, you turn it down a little bit slower. So I'm going to start by slowing down the attack. And what we're going to hear is the attack of the snare and the kick drum starting to reappear in the sound. So at the moment we have no attack. So it sounds like noise. It sounds like distortion. It sounds completely flat. And it doesn't have that attitude or punch. Once we start slowing down the attack, we're going to start hearing that punch, that attack start to come in, the attack of the drum itself to start to come in, because the attack time of the compressor is being slowed down. So let's have a listen. I'm slowing it down. Still very fast. Okay. Now we're starting to hear it. Let's do an even more extreme example just to help people really hear it. I'm turning it up now. So what I've done to get this effect, this like completely crushed drum sound, is basically I've got the ratio on full and the threshold down quite far. So now you can really hear that there's nothing coming through, right? Now let's slow down the attack. Now we can hear, especially when you hear that that drum fill, that part, you can really hear the attack of the snare drum is starting to come in. So I'm just going to now give you an A-B comparison between the two. So this is with no attack. And this is with attack slowed down. So now we're hearing the attack of the drums. We're hearing the snap. Now back to 0 attack. It's like the drums have disappeared. They sound physically further away from us as well, which is something that we need to keep in mind because you can actually use compression in a creative way to make something sound further away from you. If you shave off the attack completely of an instrument, like a drum kit, for example, you can make it sound like it's further away from you. A trick that's often used in recording studios when you aren't recording live, like in this situation, when you have the drums isolated so that there's no bleed going into it and it's just the drum kit. So you can have like a room microphone that's really capturing the ambience of the room and it's like far away from the drums. You can make it sound like it's even further away from the drums by putting a compressor on it with an extremely fast attack. so that the attack of the snare drum is being shaved off because the attack on the compressor is so fast, right? So it makes it sound like it's actually physically further away from them. And conversely, if you slow down the attack, it starts to come closer to you because suddenly it's punching through. It feels like it's actually jumping out of the speakers at you in a kind of a way. I just hit the microphone. I'm sorry. I'm such an amateur. I'm like, I'm hitting my microphone stand. Okay, so now we know what the attack time does. Okay, so this is no attack. Now this is with attack, slowed down. So now that we've got the attack time, we need to talk about the release time. So the attack and the release are the two time constants that we are working with, okay? Release time is how quickly it recovers back to neutral after it's turned the signal down, right? So to go back to the analogy, you have your music loud, the neighbor comes in, they say to turn it down, you turn it down at the speed of the attack to the point of the ratio, so that's how much you're turning it down by. And then when the neighbor leaves, how quickly do you turn it back up to the volume that it was at before? You can have a very, very fast release time. Here we have a release time of 10 milliseconds being the fastest release time. Or you can have a very slow release time, which is 2.5 seconds in this case. So I'm going to show you what it does. So this is the recovery of the compressor back to its uncompressed signal until the threshold is crossed again, and it turns it down at the speed of the attack to the point of the ratio. So I'm going to start by slowing down the release now, and we're going to start to hear the drums sounding cleaner. So right now we have the snappy attack, but we have a very fast release, so it still sounds distorted. It's not very transparent sounding. So let's slow it down. I'm slowing it down gradually. Okay. All right. Okay, now we have a much more transparent sound. I'm going to copy this and A-B it. So now I'm going to turn the release down to 0, or 10 milliseconds is the lowest it goes in this one. So let's have a listen to it. So we're hearing that it's immediately recovering, and okay, so the reason why it's distorting actually is it's immediately recovering, which means that it's recovering so fast that it's crossing the threshold instantly. So it's crossing the threshold one more time, which means it's turning it down again. So a snare drum is hit, it's turned down, and it's turning back up like virtually instantly after it's turned it down. And the snare drum is still, that one hit is still playing. That's how fast this is. 10 milliseconds is a tiny fragment of time. So when we're saying it's releasing after its attack time, it's actually still like this, that one snare drum hit is still playing. And imagine how quick a snare drum is. When you hit it, it's like this snap. It's like, it's such a fast sound. So when you have a release time that's too fast, it's actually still loud when it's released. It's still past the point of the threshold. So it's going to be turning it down again because it's just released into the threshold again and instantly turned it down. So what you're getting is this rapid turning up and down of the sound, and that rapid turning up and down of the sound, because it keeps on crossing the threshold, compressing and releasing, and then crossing it again during one snare drum, is resulting in a kind of distortion. So that's why it sounds really dirty, which is a cool sound, but that's, yeah. I'm just saying it as an example. So we have the release time too fast, and it sounds really gritty and distorted. And now I'm going to change to the other version, which is cleaner because I've got the release time slower. Now I'm changing. Okay. We can hear it very, very strongly, obviously, because this is like compressing like crazy because we've got the threshold so low and we've got the ratio so high. However, the attack and the release times are not set in a way for it to be able to distort. Okay, so its attack time is slow enough so that the punch of the drums are coming through when the compressor is engaging. The release time is slow enough for it to recover in time for the next drum hit. So it has to fully recover before the next drum hit to sound transparent. Because otherwise, you can make it so that it actually turns it down and then it hasn't even recovered to its neutral position before it's turning it down again, which I can actually demonstrate now. I'm just going to do that as well. So here, the release time is too slow. And it's actually kind of making the drums sound like really lifeless. It's almost like, I don't know, it's like you're hearing the attack come through, but the body of the drum is not really there. So let's go back to where it was before. So I've actually still got the release time pretty fast, but I've done that on purpose. So it's not so fast that it's going to be repeatedly compressing it, but I've done it in a way so that it's turning up the body, like the sustain of the drum, but it's the part of the sustain of the drum that is quiet enough so that it's not passing the threshold, so it's not compressing again. So it makes it kind of like, it sounds like you get like the oomph of the drum. Like all the body of the sound of a drum is actually in its sustain. So we're like having the attack, basically like turned down a little bit in a way that's sounding snappy, and then it's releasing quickly enough for the body to be turned up, but it's not so quick that it's distorting. So that's how I've set the attack and release here. So once we've done the timing constants, then we can go into the threshold and the ratio. So this is where you can get a little bit creative. But I will say that the vast majority of the time, the ratio is set at 4:1. Like maybe like 60 or 70% of the time, people use a 4:1 ratio. And it just works. So you're like turning it down by about 3/4. I mean, by exactly 3/4. So you're only 1/4 of the sound is poking through after the threshold. So I've just turned down the ratio, and I'm going to turn up the threshold all the way, and I'm going to start turning the threshold down. Okay. Now we're hearing the drum sound. So now we're hearing the drum sound much more snappy than it was before. And the reason for it is because of the way that we've made the compressor work. So compression can be used to make something sound more snappy, more aggressive, and more controlled at the same time when it's like a percussion instrument like this. So the reason why it sounds snappy is because of the way that attack of compression works. So I'm going to explain this to you. So this is going one step further than what we've just talked about. We're talking about now like the curve of the attack. So please bear with me. I won't overcomplicate it, I promise. When the threshold is crossed, technically the compressor is already turning it down instantly. But how soon does it get to that point of the ratio is what the attack time is actually determining, right? So you're starting to turn that volume down, and let's say, what's this one? So 14 milliseconds attack time, very fast attack, by the way. If you have a 14 millisecond attack time, that means it takes 14 milliseconds between the moment that it's crossed the threshold to the point where it hits that ratio. So it's actually going to be turning it down. As soon as the threshold is crossed, it's already turning it down, and it hits that point of the ratio, so it's turned down by 3/4 within 14 milliseconds. So that's how long it takes for the compressor to turn it down. And because of that process, and because of the shape of that, of turning it down, because you can start by turning it down slowly and then like turn it down rapidly, and that whole process is like a curve that takes 14 milliseconds. Depending on the shape of that, that curve of the attack time, you can get like really snappy sounds. So right now we have a very snappy sounding compressor. So I just wanted to also talk about these things because these are the things that most people don't talk about when they're talking about compressors. these curves are actually like the things that make different compressors sound different from one another. Okay, so we've talked about the main components of a compressor. So just to reiterate, threshold is the sensitivity. At what point do we start turning the sound down by? Ratio is how much we're turning it down. So a 2-to-1 ratio is you're halving the sound after the threshold is crossed. 4-to-1 is you're turning it down by 3/4 after the threshold is crossed. Attack time is once the threshold is crossed, how quickly does it turn down to the point of the ratio? Release time, pardon me, is how quickly does the compressor recover to its neutral position after it's turned it down. So once it's gone back to, once it's starting to release, if it crosses the threshold again, then it's going to be turning it down again, at the speed of the attack to the point of the ratio, and then releasing it at the speed of the release time. So that's how the process of compression works. So those are the main components. I'm going to talk about a couple of other things, and I'm sorry that I'm talking about so much theory. But yeah, try to bear with me. It's a YouTube video, so you're going to be able to actually go through and pause and rewind and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the first extra parameter that we should talk about is the makeup gain. So in this compressor, it's this one. It's called wet gain. I'm just using this compressor because it's like really, like you have a really huge user interface and you can see it really clearly. So if we have this at 0, so this is like it's compressing, but it's not turning it back up again. You basically, and especially if you have like, like a really low threshold, like a really sensitive threshold and a really high ratio, then you just have a really quiet signal like this because it's just turning it down, right? And actually over on the right-hand side, you might not be able to see it very clearly. We can see that it's turning it down by about negative 27 decibels. So it's really clamping down on these drums. So if we actually want to raise the volume back up to where it was to make it neutral, the way that we had it in our rough mix, we'd turn it up by 27 decibels, which is a lot. All right, a ridiculous example. Let's turn it back down to 4-to-1. Let's turn the threshold up again to where it was like, what is it? I think we had it about like, yeah, 6 decibels of compression. I'm going to turn this up by 6 decibels. And now I'm going to show you how it sounds like with this really subtle compression compared to if we had no compression at all. So this is no compression now. The drums sound good, but there's no snap. There's no attitude to it. Now I'm going to go to the compressed version. Okay. Even though it's very subtle, it sounds stronger, it sounds more in your face. Even though we've compensated for how much compression is happening, it actually sounds firmer and it sounds like more like energetic. And that's a good thing for a track like this. You don't want it to sound lackluster because the musicians are putting their all into it, and you want that to translate. Okay, I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to make myself big again. I'm going to talk about something that is actually a physiological response. Oh yeah, we clipped at some point here. Okay. Why does it sound different when we record something as opposed to when we're going to a live gig? When you're at a live gig, like even if there's no microphones on any of the instruments, maybe it's a live band that's just got like a drum kit and like, a guitar and a bass, and they're just playing like post-rock music or something like that, and they're playing it really loudly. There's no microphones on the drums. You're hearing the raw sound of the drums. There's no singer. There's no microphones on the guitar or the bass. There's no PA system. You're just hearing the guitar amps and you're hearing the acoustic drums. Why does that sound different to when you put microphones in front of it and you press record and you listen back to it after the fact? The reason is something called the acoustic reflex. The acoustic reflex is a physiological response that our ears do, like our ears themselves do. And it's basically a compressor in your own ears. So, what does that mean? It means that when a sound passes a certain point, which is what your ears determine to be the threshold, your inner ear has muscles that retract and effectively compress the signal that you're hearing. So, if you hear a snare drum in real life, your ears are immediately retracting and compressing that sound. So, we're used to hearing compression all the time. However, if you put a microphone in front of that snare drum, the microphone does not have that reflex. The microphone is giving you as linear as a response as possible. So it's giving you the exact sound that the snare drum is giving it, or more or less the exact sound. I mean, like, you know, uh, there's like, frequency responses of different microphones, different capsules give different sounds and stuff like that. But just for the sake of brevity, let's just say it's giving you the exact sound of the snare drum without the coloration of our ears compressing it. So it sounds very unnatural to us, even though that is the natural sound. So that's basically the reason. Like if you hear a drummer playing drums in front of you, your ears are constantly compressing and releasing the sound of the drums. So you're hearing it in a way that's compressing. There's also a saturation going on because your ears also distort, especially with louder sound pressure levels, like louder volume sounds in the real world. Your ears actually distort that as well. So the acoustic reflex is basically this natural physiological dynamic processing that our ears are doing in the real world. And so that's why it sounds lackluster when you have these drums with microphones really close to them. Even though you've blended them really nicely, you've balanced them in your rough mix really nicely, you can hear everything perfectly. They're all spread around the stereo spectrum, like you feel like you're actually the drummer playing. It doesn't have the attitude of being in front of a drummer and hearing them really just go at it. You know, even if we're, talking about like jazz music or something like that, and they're playing it really softly, you're still having that compression going. In fact, even at the speech level, the volume that we talk in, your ears are compressing. So this is something to keep in mind. So even when we're talking to each other, it doesn't sound the same as like if you have a microphone in front of you and you record it, So this takes us to a topic that's really, really important, especially when we're talking about compression, which is ear fatigue. So because our ears are literally working out when they're listening to music, they're contracting and retracting. There's the possibility of getting ear fatigue. So your ears getting tired of listening to the music. So when you're in front of a live band and you're hearing them without earplugs, your ears are constantly compressing and releasing. And that really tires them out. You get a lot of ear fatigue. You also get ear damage and stuff like that. So in recorded music, we want to compress things so that your ears aren't working out so much. However, your ears are always working out at least a little bit because the acoustic reflex is virtually always there. If we have it too compressed, that means your ears are going to be at a constant level of contraction. So it's constantly tensed at a very certain level because you've effectively flatlined the dynamic range. You've made the volume pretty much static. So your ears don't have any opportunity to recover. So they're actually just like stuck at one level of tension. And that is also going to cause fatigue. So too much dynamic range is going to cause fatigue because it's constantly working out. Too little dynamic range is also going to cause fatigue because it's at a constant state of tension. And what we want to do is basically do the work of the ears for, I shouldn't be talking so normatively. If, one of the things you can do is you can do the work of the ears for the listener. You can do the dynamic compression to a point where it sounds really cool. It gives you the attitude that you want. But it's not making the listener work out trying to listen to the music because that's kind of like, it's just going to make them not want to listen to it at the end of the day. Maybe that's an effect that you want. But yeah, for a song like this, I imagine the band is gonna want to have people listen to it. This isn't danger music after all, where they're having bulldozers go into the music venue like they did in the danger music days of Japan. But yeah, this is yeah. Um, Compression is probably probably equal to EQ in terms of like how important this is, because EQ, we're making we're trying to clarify everything. Compression, we're also trying to add clarity through the dynamic range of it. So something to be keeping in mind. Um, okay, so basically, I've shown you what compression is. I've done a lot of theory. That was dense. I'm sorry. I hope that you can go through and internalize it. But let's take this compressor off completely, and let's start compressing individual tracks instead of compressing the drum parent channel or the drum bus, whatever you want to call it. Let's start with the kick drum. So I want the kick drum to sound a certain way. Oh yeah, why? So okay, why would we compress individual channels as opposed to the parent channel? When you compress the parent channel, it's responding to literally everything that's going into it. If you put it on an individual track, like a kick drum, it's only going to be compressing the kick drum, and you can really dial it in for specifically the kick drum. For example, just then, when I was putting compression on the drum bus, I was compromising because the kick drum needs a different attack and release time and a different threshold um, as opposed to the snare drum. So because the kick drum is a lower frequency instrument, it actually needs slower attack and slower release because the waves are physically longer, and therefore in terms of time, they're slower. So because the wavelength is longer and the timing of the wave is slower, we need to compensate for that with the attack and release time. So let's try it on an individual track. We're going to do it on the kick drum. I'm just going to, oh, sorry. I have to change the screen. So I can see here I've got it at -3. I'm just going to turn it up so everyone can hear it. I'm going to put that compressor on it. Actually, no. We've already learnt all the names of the different parameters in a compressor. So now I'm actually going to use the free compressor which comes with Reaper, which is Recomp, REACOMP. This does virtually the exact same thing. And it just doesn't have a very good user interface. They didn't have the money to pay for a graphic designer, I guess, but it is what it is. So let's go through and put some compression on it. So now that we know, 4:1 is a good ratio, I'm just going to put it here. So here is the ratio here. I'm going to just type in 4:1. The attack I'm going to turn down to 0. Release I'm going to turn down to 0, because this is the trick, that I use all the time. I'm going to turn down the threshold until it's compressing a lot. I'm going to turn up the wet gain. Actually, I'm going to turn up the ratio to as high as it goes, infinity to 1 in this case. Okay, I'm making it distort right now because Recomp actually is capable of going down to 0 milliseconds on both the attack and the release time. Hardware compressors are not capable of doing that. That's like physically impossible in the real world. I mean, in the hardware world, I should say, not the real world. So right now we've got it literally, this is just distorting. This is what distortion sounds like. Okay. So I've got it like really extreme, right? So now I'm going to slow down the attack until I hear it punching the way that I want the kick drum to punch. Okay, now we're turning it down so far because we had the wet gain so high up. When we slowed down the attack, that meant that it's so loud, but as soon as the threshold is crossed, it's not turning it down yet, right? Because it takes a little bit of time. I mean, right now it's taking 40 milliseconds. So now we've just got like 40 milliseconds when it's just like really loud because we've turned up the output volume. That's why it's clipping. And then it's going to turn it down to the, the point of the ratio. Okay, I actually really like it at about 40 milliseconds. Just going to make it exactly 40, just so that I can, OCD. I don't actually, it's just weird. I don't know if I have OCD or not, but 40 milliseconds sounds pretty good to me. Release, I'm going to now slow it down until it stops distorting and it's recovering in a way that the body of the kick drum is coming up. However, it's not so quick that it's distorting. It's not so slow that it just sounds like it's kind of losing all of its body. So I want it to come up quick enough for the body to come up without distorting. Okay. So I can hear, right now, all we're hearing is basically just like this click of the attack of the drum, of the kick drum. But I can hear when the release is coming back up, I can hear the bass, like that booming bass of the kick drum is coming through. So this is actually at 42 milliseconds release. So that's still a very fast release, but it's not so fast that it's going to be distorting, and it's not so slow that it's going to be not even recovering before the next hit goes. So I'll show you how it would be when I have it too slow. So now we can only hear the attack. We slow it down, speed it up. Yeah. Okay, so that's some good time. I think the attack and release times are really good. I'm now going to turn this to 4:1. I'm going to make sure I don't blast my headphones by having the wet gain too high. And I'm going to turn the threshold back to neutral. So now we're not going to have any compression at all, and it's not going to make a difference to the sound. And I'm going to slowly drop down the threshold until it starts compressing how much I want it. So now it's nothing. Okay. We've got about like 5 or 6 decibels of compression, so I'm going to be boosting up the makeup gain, otherwise known as wet volume, by 6 decibels. And now I can show you what it sounds like with it, which is this, and without it, which is this. So with, you can hear it's really snappy, it's punching through. Without, it's actually the same volume. However, there's way less attitude without it. Now with it, so now we've got like a really nice compressor. I'm really happy with that. I'm gonna keep that. I'm gonna bring this down to -3 decibels, which is what we had it at before. And I'm gonna unsolo it and have a listen to it in the mix. Cool. So basically what we've done is we've compressed the dynamic range of the kick drum, and we can hear it really, really consistently. So anytime the kick drum is playing a little bit softer, it's going to turn it up to the volume of the louder hits. So it's basically like balancing out the louder and the softer hits of the drum, because, a song like this, like really the drummer is basically just playing the same volume the entire time. And you really want it to sound consistent, because the bass guitar is just by itself is really compressed anyway. So if you want the kick drum to sound really consistent, you can compress it. If you want it to sound like it's got attitude, like if you're really in front of it, you can compress it to make it sound like that as well. Let's do the snare drum next. Okay, I've soloed the snare drum. Immediately we have a problem. There's like a lot of hi-hat in the snare drum. this is always a problem. Um, I mean, if the drummer has a hi-hat, it's going to be in the snare drum microphone. And it's especially going to be a problem when we have the compressor going on it, because the compressor is actually going to be turning up the sound of the hi-hat. Anytime you put compression on any instrument, it's not just going to be compressing the instrument itself, it's also going to be turning up the background noise. So because you're turning down the loudest signals and then compensating for it with the wet volume or the output gain, um, uh, or makeup gain, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, like all the background sounds are now going to be turning up, you know, at the same time as turning up the makeup gain. So we're just going to have to deal with that. Let's go put on a recomp, and I'm going to do the same thing. Attack and release really fast, ratio really high, threshold really low. I turn up the so now we have basically pure noise. This is distorting the snare drum because we have 0 milliseconds attack, 0 milliseconds release. I'm going to slow it down. Slowing down the attack, listening for the punch of the snare drum. So that's what I'm wanting to hear. I want to hear when it sounds good to me because I'm using my taste. Okay. I've actually got quite a slow attack time by my standards. At least, I use very fast attack and release times often. Yeah, this snare drum actually needs a slower attack time because I think that this snare drum is not, you know, like the way that this drummer plays is not the way that I'm used to drummers playing. Because I mean, most of my mixing experience is in like heavy metal or like pretty like, you know, aggressive uh, music where like the drums are really going mental on it, you know. Um, and yeah, like I use much faster attack times because you really need to catch that attack, you know, like you have to catch it before it's gonna cut someone's ears off. Um, so actually, because the drum is playing gentle, I can use a much slower attack time than what I was used to. He's playing the kick drum much harder than he's playing the snare drum. Interesting thing to note. These are the things that I think about um, as a mixer. Okay, so now let's slow down the release until it's not distorting anymore. Okay. All right. I've got the release actually slower than I would normally have it as well. I think it might also be something to do with the snare drum that the drummer is using. So I've got 136 milliseconds on the release there. So that sounds good to me. I'm hearing the body of the snare drum coming through after the attack. And also, you'll notice that the ghost notes, the little rolls that the drummer is playing on the snare drum, like the those sort of things, those are starting to be nice and loud too. Often, if you're working with a drummer, they will really want you to make sure that those intricacies are coming through, because that's something that they often feel like they're lacking whenever they work with most engineers, because most engineers are really into kind of gating everything really, really hard so that all the quieter dynamics basically just disappear. That really annoys a lot of drummers, just FYI. So yeah, be nice to the musicians because it's their music at the end of the day, and they're the ones who need to be happy with the result because they're the creator. And you're basically the ones that are serving them. Yeah, so release is 136. It's keeping the ghost notes really intact as well, because yeah, like yeah, we've got the snare bottom mic, you know, pretty loud, and that's one of the things that we did in the mix prep, the rough mix that we did. So now I'm going to turn the ratio down to 4:1, and I'm going to turn the wet volume down to 0 or neutral. I'm going to turn the threshold up to neutral as well. And I'm going to start bringing the threshold down, and we're going to start hearing it. So there's nothing yet. Now we're hearing it. Okay. So we've got about 4.5 decibels of gain reduction. We can see on this meter. So let's boost it up by 4.5. Okay. Now the snare drum sounds good. So this is back in the mix. It sounds really good. We're hearing the ghost notes of the snare drum come through, which is really important. And before we couldn't really hear that as well. So let's actually compare that. So I'm turning off the compressor, try to hear the ghost notes. Okay, I'm gonna just show you this one. Before the singer sings show, there's a ghost note roll, like just these, it's just like a little roll on the snare drum. It's inaudible. We put this compressor on. Suddenly you can hear it. It's really subtle, but it's coming through. And that's important because it's part of the feel of the instrument. And that's something that you would be able to hear in real life because your ears would be compressing in real life. So this is something that is doing the work of your ears for you. Okay, I'm going to go through and talk about a few other instruments because, so usually I would go through to do like the overheads at that point. The overheads don't really need compression in this song because I think it's pretty good. Like the drum is not really doing anything too crazy. The overheads don't really need compression in my opinion. Just a touch of it can often spice things up really nicely. But for now, let's just move on. Something that really likes compression is bass guitar. Bass instruments in general, it's really, really good to compress them like quite a lot because you want the lowest frequencies of your mix to be very consistent in their dynamics and you want them to be dead center in the mix. Just because like if you have it like on the side, it's going to kind of like feel a little bit disorienting, but it's really difficult. If you don't have headphones and you're just listening on a stereo, it's always really difficult to know exactly where in the stereo field a bass instrument is coming from because bass frequencies are very omnidirectional. So it's better to keep it mono unless you're wanting people to feel off center. That's something I've actually done in the past. If I want people to feel a little bit uneasy, I would actually, put the bass over somewhere and it just like, gives this like really nauseating effect. But yeah, if you don't want that and you want it to sound really tight and really strong, keep it in the center. And if you have it too dynamic, if the bass frequencies are too dynamic, that can also sound like it's making the whole mix sound unstable. So what we should do is compress it. But in this song, actually, the bass player is really consistent. They might even have a compressor on the bass amp or something like that. Let's have a listen to it. Okay, I can hear two very distinct effects going on, or three, I should say. One is that there is an octave effect on it. So everything that the bassist plays is being affected so that it also has the same notes playing an octave lower. So you've got two octaves of the same note. The other one is that it's actually compressing, but I don't know if it's because of the nature of the amp itself, because sometimes the amps that you use can compress because of the just because of the circuitry. Not that it's actually got a compressor circuit built into it, but rather that like just by a byproduct of the circuitry, it just naturally compresses the signal. Same with the speaker that you use. The speakers can compress the signal. But also the bassist is using some distortion. There's some really mild saturation on this bass guitar and it's really tasteful. And it's giving it some extra harmonics, just like the octave pedal is doing. this, this really subtle distortion is quite tasteful, and it gives it extra harmonics and it makes it sit in the mix really nicely. Remember, we actually didn't put any EQ on this instrument because it sounded so good, and we were able to just build the rest of the mix around it based on just kind of like balancing. Okay, so let's try to compress it a little bit just for the sake of it, and let's see what it does. Putting recomp on it. So this time, should we do the same trick? I mean, yeah, there is a little bit of pluckiness going on in the bass, and maybe we want to bring that out. So let's try bringing that out. Ratio as high as it goes, attack and release really low. Gonna bring the threshold really far down. Okay, we got distortion. I'm gonna slow down the attack. Nice. Okay. I'm actually liking it. I'm gonna put this compressor on it for sure, because like actually it's making it sound way more percussive and punchy. So why not? Let's put it in. It's part of the rhythm section. May as well. So the attack I've got quite I would say for me this is a medium. I mean yeah, like I think medium attack is usually considered like 100 milliseconds, but I am, really into fast times. So I've got it about 60. I'm going to slow down the release until it's distorting right now. I don't want it to distort because there's already distortion on it, and we want to keep the bassist's taste intact. Nice. Okay, and this I'm actually going to do it a little bit harder. I'm going to give a 6-to-1 ratio instead of a 4-to-1 ratio. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. I'm going to turn the wet gain down because now we're compressing it less, so it's going to doesn't need as much output gain. And bass, you can really pummel it. Like you can really compress the hell out of it. So I've got it actually compressing at about 10 decibels gain reduction, which is what this red meter is showing us. So I'm going to turn up the wet by 10 decibels, and now it's going to bring it up to neutral. Nice. So now the bass and the drums are sitting so nicely together. Like it sounds really, really tight to me. They're really consistent, and yeah, I think it's really tasteful sounding to me. Let's try it on the guitars. Guitars are going to need faster attacks, faster releases. Maybe I'm going a little bit too slow. I'm thinking, should I even do the guitars? Like, I mean, it's the same process as everything else. I can maybe I'll just go through and say what are common things to look out for on different instruments. So let's go back to the drums. Let's talk about the overheads. Overheads are this basically cymbal microphones. Maybe, yeah, I like to not really think about them as cymbal microphones. I think it's too much of a common thing for people to think about overheads as cymbal microphones. But yeah, like it's the overhead microphones. They're capturing everything around it. They're capturing the cymbals and the snare drum, the toms, and actually like a lot of the body of these instruments are coming through. And sometimes, especially with more aggressive drummers, the overheads need compression on it because every time the snare drum hits, it's really peaking up on the overhead microphone. So often you need quite fast attack and fast release and really hard ratio compression on it, so that every time the snare drum hits, it's just ducking down on the snare drum. But oftentimes when the cymbals hit, it's not really compressing them that much. It's just when the snare drum hits, it's ducking it down a little bit. Toms, if you have toms in the drums, it's quite similar to the bass drum. So they're lower frequency instruments, so your timing has to be slower. Your attack and release timing has to be slower. 4-to-1 ratio is a really safe bet for it. Guitars, depending on what kind of guitar, like a guitar like this, I'll just show you what the guitars are doing. It's really plucky. Really like percussive guitar stuff. Yeah, like you basically just want to have like attack time that's fast enough to really capture it. So like I would say like 15 to 25 milliseconds or something like that attack time, like pretty fast. That's an extremely fast attack time in the hardware world. Like if you can get like 10 milliseconds, like you've got a very fast compressor in hardware usually. Yeah, so that's guitars. Keys, depending on what kind of keyboard it is. I mean, the Rhodes doesn't need compression at all, really. Like, listen to this. It's completely compressed already. There's almost no dynamic range in it. But then it does something else. I think here it's more. Actually, it still doesn't have much dynamic range at all. It's just louder in volume. We can change the volume of it later with automation. So that's not going to need compression at all. Horns often does need compression. Okay, let's give it compression because actually it sounds really weak. Let's do recomp. The same trick. So attack and release as fast as it goes. Ratio is as high as it goes. Threshold is low. Okay, so I want the every time the horn hits, I want it to actually kind of like pop through a little bit with the attack time. So I want to get that happening. Sorry, there's a glitch in Reaper that's really annoying with those like you see like where it says insert track effects. So sorry, I have to always like move it around. Okay, so let's slow down the attack. Okay. Okay, so I've got a pretty slow attack time, 100 milliseconds approximately. I'm just going to loop this just because I want to hear it on loop. I'm slowing down the release. Okay, 71 sounds really good to me. When I had it at about 120, it didn't sound that good to me. It was like, it was just kind of disappearing. But if I want the horns to be really, in your face, which I think that this really is calling for it, that's going to be good. Actually, let's open that up again because I forgot. We have to bring the ratio down 4-to-1. It's really safe. I'm going to make wet neutral. Okay, and now we can see every note that the horn section plays, it is compressing it a little bit. So the louder notes are being compressed more, the quieter notes are going to be compressed less. So the quietest note is compressed by 1 decibel. The loudest note is compressed by 4 decibels. So I'm going to turn this up by, just to average it out, I'm going to say 2.5 decibels wet gain. Okay, sounds really good to me. Let's hear it in the mix. Okay, it's a little bit better. Maybe we need a bit more compression, actually. Let's do that. Give it 6 decibels instead. Cool. Sounds good to me now. Cool. Okay, sounds good to me. All right. So now we get to the most important one, the vocals. So this is the last thing we're going to be doing today. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. we're going to be compressing the vocals, and this is notoriously the most challenging thing to compress. And I will tell you, there is one parameter that we haven't talked about, which is the knee. And I'm going to show you that with Pro C, Pro C2 from FabFilter. Cool. So when we have a ratio, let's say like a ratio that's like infinity to 1, like completely flatlining it. If you have a hard knee, it means that as soon as it gets to that threshold point, it's going to turn it down. If you soften the knee, it's actually making the threshold and the ratio variable. So it's smoothing out the threshold and the ratio. So the threshold is not at this defined point anymore. It starts compressing at lower ratios as it approaches the points of the threshold, and it gets to higher ratios as it passes that threshold, right? So like if you have it at lower, at a lower ratio, like 4:1 or something like that, you can see it's just kind of curving it instead of having like this hard point of compression. And what that does is it makes it more transparent. So you're not hearing this sudden onset of compression. You're hearing this gradual compression, which is actually much more similar to how our ears work. Our ears, with the acoustic reflex, have a very interesting style of compression where it's a very soft knee, um, and the ratio is basically like a really gradual infinity to 1 ratio. So it eventually limits. Like if you have a bomb explode, 100 meters away from you, like your ears are gonna like compress it to a limit, basically. In fact, it's gonna compress it beyond a limit. It actually like cuts out the sound briefly, and then it brings it back in once it's once that threshold is crossed again. Like once the moment of that threshold crossing is gone. Sorry, I should say. Like so, actually, you can hear that in when you go to the movies and stuff. Like, and you see like an action movie, and you see an explosion go off in the action movie. A lot of the time, you're not hearing this. Right, it doesn't sound like this, big continuous thing, which is what it actually sounds like in the real world. You hear this like, right, just to give a onomatopoeic sound to it. And that sound is you have the onset, your ears clamping down entirely, so completely silencing the sound, and then you hear the rest of the release. Sorry, I keep hitting this microphone stand. You hear the rest of the release after the moment the threshold is crossed is gone, right? So yeah, our ears have a very interesting compression style. Also, the attack and the release times are also variable in our ears with the with the acoustic reflex. So when something's hitting harder, your ears compress it faster. The attack time is faster, and the release time is slower. So the louder the volume, the faster it compresses and the slower it releases. So these are the ways that our ears work with the acoustic reflex. Something to keep in mind. So if we want it to sound more transparent to us, we have to mimic that a little bit. So let's mimic it with bringing in a softer knee. So this is bringing a soft knee into it. So if we have like a really hard ratio, I'm just gonna like solo the voice. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. So I will say this is going to be a subtle thing, so don't worry if you don't hear it that well, okay? So I'm just going to demonstrate what it sounds like with a hard knee. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. And now a softer knee. Actually, I should do it with a not as intense a threshold, sorry. Let's do hard knee one more time and just brought the ratio down. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. So to me, I can really hear that compression is happening right now. I'm going to soften the knee. Still going to be too much compression, but let's have a listen. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. And now it sounds much more gentle. So it sounds more transparent, but actually it's compressing by the same amount. So if you want a compressor to sound aggressive, have a harder knee. if you want it to sound really soft and transparent, have a softer knee. So one more time, I'm going to show you the A, B. So hard knee. So the way this sounds to me in a psychoacoustic frame of mind is that it sounds like my ears are just, really kind of like being worked out. Like that's the psychoacoustic effect of I'm actually getting like a psychoacoustic ear fatigue from hearing it like that. But once I soften it, it's still hard. Now softening it. Now one more time. Now it's like, it's not, it feels like in a psychoacoustic, psychosomatic kind of a way, it feels like I'm not working as hard. My ears aren't working as hard to compress the voice. So this is something that we need to think about when we're compressing a voice. So we've spoken about how dynamic a voice is and how difficult it is to control the dynamic range of a voice. The trick that like every engineer uses is using almost all the time two compressors on the voice. One with a softer ratio and a soft knee, and one with a higher ratio. And depending on what your tastes are, you can have a harder knee, you can have different attack and release times, set your threshold however you want. Like if you've got like a heavy metal track or something and you need your voice to be really consistently playing over the top of like really loud guitars, or if you're, if you got like electronic music and you got really blaring synths and you need a vocal to really cut through, your second compressor is also going to be needing to be quite hard, quite aggressive. So higher ratios, harder knees, stuff like that. So let's do the first compressor first. And so what I would often do is I would have like a 2-to-1 ratio. And I would be making it so that it's compressing almost all the time with a really soft knee. And the attack and release times are not that important with the first compressor because it's not compressing it by that much. You're not really going to be hearing the attack and release times. Just don't have them too fast or too slow. Basically, like, keep them at default and it's going to be fine. If it sounds like, the vocal is kind of disappearing a little bit, it might be that the release is too slow. So I'm going to turn up the threshold. I'm going to turn this down now. And so what I'm really wanting to listen for with the first compressor, the first of two compressors that I'm using on the vocal, I want to hear it so that it's like, I don't feel like it's compressing, but I can hear things clearer. So I really do not want to hear any compression at all. So if I can fool myself into thinking there's no compression happening at all, but things are just clearer, it's like someone's like, lifted a veil from in front of my eyes and I can just see the voice as if it's like brand new. It's like I've achieved what I need to. So let's listen to this. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. So I'll copy that to A and B. Now this is without any compression at all. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. So away, when she sings that, it goes really quiet, right? So now I'm bringing it back to that setting that I had it before. Now we're going to listen to those quieter dynamics. And if you can see it clearer, then if you can hear it clearer, then it's good. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. So now we're hearing it louder. We're hearing the louder parts quieter. So it's like closer to what the quieter dynamics are. So now we can turn this up. It was 6 decibels of compression, so I'm giving it 6 decibels of gain. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Great. Now we got a really transparent compressor on the voice. So now let's listen to it in context of the song. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Okay, when she sings way away, it's still dying down a little bit, right? Like it's still starting to get masked by the rest of the sound. So now let's put on the second compressor, and this time I'm going to put on the Reaper one, because I don't need to give you the I'm sorry. I hope it's not COVID. Um, yeah, so I'm going to show you, because yeah, I don't need to show you the user interface anymore. So now I'm going to do a 4:1 ratio, um, which is more normal. I'm going to set the attack and the release really fast. Actually, let's do the trick again. So infinity ratio, attack and release on 0. I'm going to bring the compressor down so the threshold is really. I'm also going to solo it. So I'm going to have basically it's just going to obliterate the voice. Okay, so I'm going to slow down the attack. Okay, so when I'm slowing down the attack of the voice, I'm wanting to actually hear the articulations in the voice. So a voice consists of vowels and consonants. And so when we are singing a vowel, it's going to be much louder than a consonant because a consonant is just a mouth sound. A vowel is like your vocal folds actually, engaging and vibrating and making a sound, making a pitch. But the tiny little sounds that we make with our mouth, they're basically just like nothing, right? And also, like, a lot of singers have like a little like a certain quality about their voice, which is like when they start singing a voice, when they say like that how like the sound like sort of pops into existence, that onset is unique from between every singer. And we want to capture that onset because that's actually what's going to give the character to the voice. So I want to make sure that that part is what's coming through. So that's the quieter part of the dynamic range that I want to bring up to the same volume or approximately the same volume as the louder part of the dynamic of the voice, so that we can hear the character of this singer. Because when this singer is singing by themselves, they're going to be hearing that, these characters, because their cranial resonance and their acoustic reflex is going to be doing all sorts of stuff, and we're going to be hearing these intricacies. They're going to be hearing these intricacies a lot stronger than they would if they hear it recorded in this mix. So that's what I'm listening for when I'm slowing down the attack. I want to hear that, the onset of the sounds, the mouth sounds, all these sorts of things are the things that I want to really capture. So let's have a listen to it again. I've got it at 20 milliseconds. Is it doing what I want to do? Let's find out. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Show you all the magic that a perfect love can make. Yeah, like I'm hearing it. So 20 milliseconds is really good. So voice can actually take faster attack times. Let's slow down the release until it's not distorting anymore. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Show you all the magic that a perfect love can make. I just noticed that the compressor is doing something strange, and it's because of the background sounds. And you know what? I just realized I've been putting the compression on the vocal track instead of the vocal parent track, which means that there's a lot of background noise that we haven't filtered out. Let's actually put this EQ here, and I'm just going to take it off here. So now the EQ is actually cutting out the bass frequencies. So what I was hearing was like sometimes it's ducking down, and I'm like, why is it ducking down? There's no vocal in that part, and it's actually because like the bass, the background bass, is what's engaging the compressor. So now we have that out. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Okay, cool. So that's compressing. The timing is right now, I think. Let's put it on 4:1. I'm going to bring the wet down again. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Okay, let's actually start bringing up the knee because it's still too aggressive for me. Warm you in my arms and melt your fears away. Show you. Okay. All the magic that a perfect love can make. Beautiful. Okay, so I've softened the knee size, and that's now giving me what I want. Let's give it like 5. Okay, so when you have something that's like much more dynamic, the makeup gain has to be in accordance to like an average of how much your gain reduction is, how much is the compressor is turning it down. Because like, yeah, like sometimes it's going to turn it down by a lot. Like sometimes it's actually turning it down by like 12 decibels. Sometimes it's turning it down by like 1 decibel. Um, so yeah, let's just kind of average it out, 5 decibels, see how it sits in the mix now. Cool. Okay. Okay, so something interesting is happening here. I think what they've done is they've actually taken the vocal performance of one take that they did and the horns performance of another take that they did, and the horns part was different um, in the new take as opposed to the previous take. And so what we would actually have to do is go through and edit out every time the singer stops singing. We'd have to cut that out because now that we've put the compressors on it, because we put 2 compressors on it, it's bringing up all this background noise, and we're now noticing these like extra horns that have been playing this entire time in the spill of the vocal mic because the performances are different. So that's a problem. Now we've got clashing horns. I'm not going to do that in this session. I can do that another time. Yeah, but we basically have a sound. However, I think the astute listener would hear that this has changed the timbre of the voice. We now have, I mean, before the compression, we had a much more airy sounding vocal than now. The reason is when you compress something, it's often going to make it sound duller just by the nature of compression. It's going to make it sound more dull than if you had simply kept it without compression and only had EQ on it. So oftentimes you'll EQ something before the compressor to take out any extra excess, frequencies that you don't want. And after the compressor, you would add in what you do want. So right now, I really want some more high frequencies. So I'm going to put in a re-EQ. I'm going to boost up the highs a little bit. That's pretty nice. Cool. We've got the airiness back. So basically, we had less airiness when we compressed. Now we brought it back by boosting it up after the compression. Okay. This has revealed a few new problems, but they're not problems that we're going to be dealing with today. But I will tell you what it is. The S and T sounds of the singer are now way more pronounced because all of the consonants have been turned up as a byproduct of compressing the voice. We're going to have to go through and do some compression on those specific frequencies with something called a de-esser, which is something that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. So that's it for today. If you have any questions along the way, please email your questions, message the Discord, anything you need help with, anything that I haven't clarified properly that you need a little bit more help understanding, please message me. We can even do one-on-one sessions. Like if you need to really get your head around something, that's something that we can do, like just a quick, just a quick call or something like that to go through it. And yeah, I hope it's been effective because like it honestly, wait, I'll make it the big screen. Honestly, yeah, it's kind of strange talking to just my laptop. I hope I was able to get things across. It's it is challenging not having the direct interaction and the direct feedback and stuff like that. But yeah, let me know if there's anything I can improve. Let me know if there's anything you need help with. And yeah, if not, then I will see you soon. Thank you all for tuning in.